Hello, and welcome to episode 16 of Sarastro's Star Wars Legion painting series. In this episode we're going to paint General Grievous from Fantasy Flight Games' Star Wars Legion. General Grievous is a wonderful miniature with multiple options for elements like the cloak, number of arms and lightsabers, and the positioning of the limbs. He's also quite straightforward to paint, but presents opportunities for some quite fun optional finishing touches should you choose to add them. Let's take a look at the painting stages. We'll begin as usual by assembling and priming the miniature, and I'll be providing some zenithal highlights, although a plain prime in white would also be okay. Grievous can then be painted quite quickly to a good tabletop standard using the Citadel contrast colours, along with some regular paints for the lightsabers where I'll be creating an optional gradient to add interest. Our finishing touches may include adding some gentle object source lighting. I'll also share my approach to painting the cloak, and I'll be having some fun with some optional weathering and battle damage. Let's begin. After cutting all of the parts from the sprue, I'm going to begin by assembling the miniature by gluing the parts together that can only be attached in one specific way. This will include gluing the feet to the legs, both halves of the torso, the shoulder armour, and the two parts that make up the head. I'm now attaching the legs, and I'm gluing the figure to the base. With one of my Grievouses, I ended up gluing the left leg a little high, so here I'm just placing a piece of cork rock beneath. With the four-armed pose without the cloak, I'm now gluing down the collar piece, followed by the head, which I've chosen to position looking straight on. Here I've just used some white tack to temporarily hold the lower two arms in position whilst I try out some poses, and there's a huge array of options for you to consider here. Once the final pose has been decided, we can go ahead and glue the arms in place. If you've chosen to build the version with the cloak, that too will need assembling. And here, just to make the seam a little less obvious, I'm brushing on some matte varnish by Vallejo to fill the gap. I've chosen to prime and paint the cloak separately, however, for ease of access, so we'll be sticking this down along with the head later on. I'm now priming the figure in black, followed with some grey and white zenithal highlights just as described in the previous episodes. However, a plain prime in white would also be okay. I skipped the white for the cloak, however, as it's going to be mostly dark grey. Before adding some colour, I'm going to provide a pure white undercoat for the blades of the lightsabers, a step that you can obviously skip if you've primed in pure white. This may need 2 or 3 thin coats for a smooth, solid finish. I'm now mixing in a little black to achieve some pale grey tones, which I'm using to brighten up some sections of the pale armour plating that turned out a little dark after the zenithal highlights, and also any areas which are particularly close to the lightsaber blades, which I want to appear more well lit. I'm paying extra attention to the values like this to lessen the need to add highlights later on, due to the translucency of the contrast colours I'll be applying in a moment. We're now ready to add some colour. I'm going to begin by painting all of the areas of black metal using black Templar, which I'm thinning with a little contrast medium to allow a little more of the underlying values to show through. For some of the flatter upturned areas, you'll see me brushing off some of the excess to effectively create more of a highlight. Here, once again, you can see me removing the paint from this upturned section of the upper left leg, which I really want to appear more highlighted. I'm also using this for the handles of the lightsabers. For the ivory tone of the armour plating, I'm using a 3-to-1 mix of Skeleton Horde and Iyanden Yellow, lightened and desaturated with 2 parts of Apothecary White. Just as I did with the B1 battle droids, you can see I also like to have some of the medium in a neighbouring well, which I might use to dampen the brush when thinning or removing excess paint from the flatter surfaces. Once again, it's these smoother, upturned areas where I really want to thin or brush away some of the paint. Our Grievous is now looking pretty good, and there's not much else you need to do if you don't wish to. Before painting the lightsabers, I've chosen to apply some basing, just as described in the previous episode. I'm doing this now just so that I can better judge the overall balance of tones and contrast when I apply the more optional finishing touches in a moment. Once the paste is dry, I'm providing a dry brush of Tyrant Skull, followed with my Geonosis shade mix of Agrax Earthshade and Fuegan Orange. Finally, I'm going to paint the 2 green lightsabers using Vallejo's Fluorescent Green. This will need a few thin layers before we have a solid, even coat. These could be left as they are, but to add a little more interest, I've chosen to create a gradient by simply adding white to the green and brushing this down towards the handle end of the blade. The easiest way to achieve a smooth gradient here is to add just a little white at a time and build the effect up in multiple layers. Naturally, the lighter I go, the further I move down the handle of the blade. This does of course produce a somewhat stylized look, and you could equally invert the gradient by placing the whiter tones towards the end instead if you like. Any really noticeable transitions can be dealt with by brushing a thin intermediate tone on top. For the blue lightsabers, I've chosen Scalecolor's Tesla Blue, which I've picked for its slightly purplish tone. This is fairly dark however, so I'm starting by lightening it with some white. The Scalecolor paints in particular will require several thin layers before we have a flat, even finish. And I'm now creating the gradients by adding some additional white, just as we did with the green lightsabers. Although I've chosen to approximate Grievous's appearance from the movies, you could of course paint the lightsabers any colour you like. With that done, our Grievous is looking more than battle ready. If you want to take him that bit further, join me now for some optional finishing touches. To begin, I've chosen to briefly sharpen some of the edges of the armour plating using some ivory. You can see I'm especially interested in the areas which are closest to the blades of the lightsabers. I'm now mixing a very pale grey and doing the same for some of the areas of black metal. I'm also adding some further edge highlights to the armour plating along the way. Next, I'm going to add some subtle object source lighting by creating a very thin glaze using the Fluorescent Green thinned down with plenty of Lahmian Medium. This can then be brushed over any areas that we'd like to receive a green tint due to the glow of the lightsabers. If you can barely notice a difference, that's a good thing, because we can build the effect up in a couple of layers with less chance of suddenly going too far. The main thing to avoid here is letting the glaze pool. I'm now doing the same with the Tesla Blue. There's nothing wrong with letting the green and blue glazes overlap. Using glazes like this will dull some of the edge highlights slightly, so here I'm mixing an off-white using the lightsaber tones and using this to do some final sharpening of the edge definition. Before moving on, let's take a look at how I've painted the cloak. For the back of the cloak, I've chosen to provide a solid base tone using a dark grey, somewhere in between Mechanicus Standard Grey and Vallejo's German Grey. You could mix something similar using whatever greys, black or white you like of course. The main thing I'm aiming for is a tone that allows the cloak to actually appear dark grey, but also one that's just light enough for the black design to read clearly. I'm now going to highlight the cloak by adding small amounts of ivory in a few stages. Starting with a lighter base tone and throwing on a dark shade is also an option worth considering that would save you some time. But for a single hero figure like this, I prefer to aim for a little more control and refinement. I'm going to continue work on these highlights in a moment once the cloak is attached to the figure. First, I'm going to paint the inner lining. For that, I'm going to use Mephiston Red mixed with some dark sea blue. Notice on the left I have some pure Mephiston Red which I'll be using in a moment. I'm now using the darker tone to paint most of the lining, except I'll be leaving a couple of more exposed patches at the sides which will be receiving a little more light. I'm now using pure Mephiston Red to paint these lighter areas, which can be loosely blended with the darker tone. Because my paint was a little on the thin side, here I've just added a second layer to create a more solid tone. Once dry, you may like to apply a shade such as Carroburg Crimson, or even a mix of the red and pink contrast colours to darken down the recesses. I'm now giving a final boost to the edges of the cloak with the Mephiston Red. And before gluing it into place, I'm brushing some matte varnish onto both surfaces, just to give a stronger finish for the glue to adhere to. I'm now gluing the cloak in place. And I'm painting the collar piece just as we did the rest of the armour plating. This means providing a light grey to white base coat. followed with the same contrast colours mix we used earlier. Next we can attach the head, and I'm now applying a few final highlights for the cloak. Along the way, I've chosen to add a little more depth to the shadows by mixing in some black and some dark sea blue. I'm now going to use a black and dark sea blue mix to paint the design on the back of the cloak. As usual for graphical elements like this, I like to add a little flow enhancer to help me achieve clean, flat lines. I'm now building up one or two of the nearby highlights to help make the design read a little more clearly. Finally, I'm going to dry brush on a mix of Mournfang Brown and Zandri Dust to create a little dusty weathering for the base of the cloak. And here I'm mixing in a little ivory. With that done, I'm now going to add some gentle weathering and imperfections to the armour plating, using quite a thinned down mix of black and USA Olive Drab, but any dark brown black tone would be fine. Notice that I've kept the paint quite thin for this. For this General Grievous, I've chosen to also add some more extreme battle damage, inspired by the legendary outfit from Star Wars Battlefront 2. For that, I'm going to begin by applying some far more opaque patches of black scarring. I'm then using some pure white to dab on some small patches roughly within each of these areas. I might go over these a couple of times to ensure it's as white as can be. We can then brush over whatever fiery tones you like. I'm using the Vallejo fluorescent colours for this, starting with the yellow. I'm then using the magenta and orange on top, but allowing some bits of the yellow to remain. I'm now continuing to add damage elsewhere on the miniature. Next I'm going to paint the eyes, and I'm starting by using some Screamer Pink mixed with some black for the area just beneath each one. I'm now picking out the whites of each eye with some pure white, avoiding the central slit if possible. And I'm now painting over this with the fluorescent yellow mixed with a little of the orange. Finally, I'm going to finish off the base with a light sprinkling of Army Painter's Brown Battleground. And this completes General Grievous. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you have enjoyed the episode. Do please let me know if you have by leaving a like and by subscribing to the channel to ensure you don't miss future episodes. As always, you'll find a full product list in the video description below, where you can also find links to where I can be reached on Instagram, Spotify, Facebook and Twitter. Join me again soon as we continue painting the Clone Wars miniatures from Star Wars Legion. Happy painting!